When corporations became governments, the cyberpunk timeline. What if I told you that the cyberpunk future isn't coming? It's already here. While we were waiting for flying cars and neon-lit streets, corporations quietly became more powerful than governments. Amazon controls more global commerce than most countries' entire economies. Google decides what information billions of people see daily. Meta owns digital territories where 3 billion people live their virtual lives. Let's trace the timeline of how we sleepwalked into a corporate dystopia. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into the most uncomfortable truth of our time. The corporate megacorp from cyberpunk fiction didn't stay in the books, they became reality. We'll examine Amazon, Google, Meta, and others not as tech companies, but as what they really are. Digital nation-states with their own currencies, laws, territories, and power structures that rival traditional governments. By the end of this video, you'll see why the cyberpunk authors weren't writing science fiction. They were writing prophecy. But first, let's establish what makes a government, because once you understand that, you'll realize these corporations check every single box. Let's start with Amazon, and I want you to think about this not as a shopping website, but as a sovereign entity. Amazon Web Services powers 30% of the internet. When AWS goes down, entire countries lose internet functionality. That's infrastructure control at a national level. Amazon has its own currency system through credits and gift cards. Billions of dollars circulate in Amazon's economy without ever touching traditional banking. They have their own logistics network that rivals national postal services, with delivery trucks, planes, and warehouses in every major city globally. But here's where it gets dystopian. Amazon has its own security force. Not just warehouse security, I'm talking about corporate intelligence operations. They've been caught spying on activist groups, monitoring employee communications, and even infiltrating worker organizing efforts. They have facial recognition systems, predictive policing algorithms, and surveillance networks that would make authoritarian governments jealous. Amazon even has its own legal system through their marketplace dispute resolution. Millions of businesses live or die by Amazon's algorithmic judgments. They can seize assets, freeze accounts, and destroy livelihoods with zero due process. That's judicial power. Now Google, the Ministry of Truth from 1984, made real. Google doesn't just have a monopoly on search, they have a monopoly on reality itself for billions of people. Whatever Google's algorithm decides is true becomes functionally true for most of humanity. Google Maps literally shapes how people move through physical space. Google Calendar controls when people meet. Gmail reads your private communications to build psychological profiles for advertising. Google Photos has scanned and catalogued billions of private family moments. But the real power is in information control. Google can memory hole any information by simply not indexing it. They can promote or suppress any narrative through search rankings. They've done this, promoting COVID information from certain sources while suppressing others regardless of accuracy. That's propaganda control at a scale Stalin could only dream of. And through Android, Google has direct access to the location, communications, and behavior patterns of over 3 billion people in real time. No intelligence agency in history has had this level of surveillance capability. Meta might be the most obvious corporate government. Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp together govern the social lives of over 3 billion people. That's larger than China and India combined. Meta has its own constitution, the community standards, and its own Supreme Court, the Oversight Board, that makes binding decisions about what speech is allowed in their territories. They have their own currency through digital payments and attempted to launch Libra, which would have been a global cryptocurrency controlled by a private corporation. But here's the kicker. Meta literally controls elections. Not through conspiracy theories, but through documented algorithm changes that affect voter turnout, information exposure, and political messaging reach. They've admitted in congressional testimony that their platforms influenced election outcomes in multiple countries. Meta also controls digital identity verification for millions through Facebook login, decides what news stories billions of people see, and shapes public opinion through algorithmic content curation. They've started wars, literally contributed to genocide in Myanmar through unchecked misinformation spread. When a corporation's policies can lead to ethnic cleansing, that's government-level power. In 1984, William Gibson published Neuromancer and introduced us to megacorporations that had replaced governments as the primary power structures. The Tessier-Ashpool Corporation controlled entire space stations, had private militaries, and governed the lives of millions of employees. Sound familiar? Gibson wrote about corporate executives making decisions that affected entire populations, private security forces, and information control systems. But here's what's terrifying. Reality exceeded the fiction. Gibson's corporations were limited to physical space and cyberspace. Our corporate overlords control psychological space too. They don't just monitor your actions, they predict and influence your thoughts, emotions, and decisions through psychological manipulation algorithms. The Shadowrun role-playing game introduced the concept of corporate extraterritoriality, where corporate headquarters were sovereign territory with their own laws and security forces. Players thought this was fantasy. But look at today's big tech campuses. Apple Park, Google's Googleplex, Amazon's new headquarters. These are self-contained cities with their own transportation, healthcare, food services, and security. Employees live entire lives within corporate ecosystems using company housing, company stores, company healthcare, company social networks. The tech giants have created exactly what Shadowrun predicted: corporate nations, where employees are more citizens than workers. And just like in Shadowrun, these corporate citizens often have more loyalty to their corporate employer than to their actual government. Cyberpunk authors weren't just imagining cool aesthetic futures, they were economists and political scientists who understood power dynamics better than the experts. Neil Stephenson predicted cryptocurrency in Cryptonomicon. Bruce Sterling wrote about surveillance capitalism in Islands in the Net. Kim Stanley Robinson described climate catastrophe driven by corporate interests decades before it became mainstream. These weren't lucky guesses. They understood that technology doesn't exist in a vacuum. It amplifies existing power structures. When you give corporations better tools for control, surveillance, and influence, they become more powerful than governments. It's simple systems thinking that somehow escaped traditional political science. Let's talk numbers because the scale is mind-boggling. Apple's market cap has exceeded the GDP of most countries, including Canada, Russia, and Brazil. Amazon's revenue is larger than the GDP of most nations. But market cap isn't the real measure, it's influence and control. Amazon controls the commerce infrastructure for millions of businesses. One Amazon outage can crash entire sectors of the economy. When Facebook goes down, political movements lose their primary organizing platform. When Google changes its algorithm, entire industries collapse overnight. This isn't theoretical, we've seen it happen. Google's algorithm updates have destroyed legitimate businesses overnight. Facebook's policy changes have killed media companies. Amazon's marketplace decisions have bankrupted manufacturers. These companies wield economic life and death power over millions of people and thousands of businesses. But surely governments regulate these corporate powers, right? Wrong. We're seeing the opposite regulatory capture on a scale that would make robber barons blush. Former Google executives run government AI initiatives. Ex-Facebook employees design social media regulations. Amazon has hired more former CIA and NSA employees than most defense contractors. The revolving door between big tech and government agencies means the same people write corporate policies and government regulations. Look at antitrust enforcement. It's been neutered not through lobbying alone, but through intellectual capture. The Chicago School of Economics convinced regulators that monopolies are only bad if they raise prices. So companies like Google can have 90% market share as long as their services are free. It's regulatory capture through academic proxy. Here's the most dystopian part. These corporations don't just influence laws, they write them directly. The Digital Services Act in Europe, Section 230 in America, privacy regulations worldwide, they're all written by teams that include corporate lawyers from the very companies being regulated. Tech companies spend more on lobbying than oil companies, pharmaceutical companies, and defense contractors combined. They're not just buying politicians, they're buying the entire policy framework. And when regulations do pass, they're written to benefit incumbent giants while crushing potential competitors. Facebook supported GDPR because compliance costs hurt smaller competitors more than established giants. It's regulatory moats disguised as consumer protection. So here we are, living in the cyberpunk timeline, but without the cool leather jackets and neon aesthetics. We got the corporate dystopia, but instead of chrome implants and virtual reality escapes, we got smartphones and social media addiction. The cyberpunk authors weren't writing fiction. They were writing prophecy. They understood that when you concentrate information, infrastructure, and influence in the hands of a few massive corporations, you don't get innovation and efficiency. You get digital feudalism. The question isn't whether we live in a corporate dystopia. We clearly do. The question is what we're going to do about it. Because unlike in the cyberpunk novels, we don't have to wait for a scrappy hacker protagonist to save us. We can still choose to build a different future. But that choice is getting more limited every day these corporate governments consolidate power. What do you think? Are we living in the cyberpunk timeline, or am I being too dramatic? Have you noticed corporate power creeping into areas that used to be government territory? Let me know in the comments below. And if this video opened your eyes to the reality of corporate power, subscribe for more uncomfortable truths about the world we're actually living in. Hit that notification bell, because YouTube's algorithm might not show you content that questions big tech power. Funny how that works. Next week, we'll dive into how to protect yourself in this corporate dystopia, so make sure you're subscribed. Thanks for watching, and remember, in a world where corporations are governments, every purchase is a vote.